Hello everyone, welcome back to the kitchen table. Today on the kitchen table, a bit of a field trip again. I've been off to have a very interesting chat with a UK software startup who just may have come up with something that could revolutionise the future of flying these guys around in our airspace. But before we go on to that, it is of course the kitchen table, and tradition dictates that we have a beverage when we're discussing drones or drone related matters. A welcome return for some. I know you're a bit concerned that I've gone teetotal. Fear not. Welcome return to an alcoholic beverage. A cheeky dry chilled rosé today from Australia. We've got the Hardy's Crest, Southeast Australian rosé, and very refreshing it is indeed. So cheers everyone. Very nice. So yeah, I was kindly invited to go and speak to a company called Altitude Angel by their CEO and co-founder Richard Parker, because they have come up with what I thought was a really fascinating and potentially groundbreaking concept about how drones like ours and bigger and smaller versions can all get along nicely with each other and with other airspace users like aircraft, and also perhaps not get themselves into trouble by flying to places they oughtn't to be. Anything that makes it easy for us to obey the rules and regulations gets my vote. So I was really fascinated to find more about the system. So without further ado, let's go and meet Altitude Angel. So, Richard Parker from Altitude Angel, thank you very much for inviting me along to talk about you and the company. Can you just tell me a little bit about Altitude Angel, where the company's come from and what you do?
Sure. So I guess in a nutshell, the easiest way to describe Altitude Angel today is that we do automatic air traffic control for drones.
Awesome. Tell me more, you tease.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, we're a cloud services company. So we provide our service to any vendor, to any software manufacturer, anyone who basically makes flying things. Okay. They can access our services, and we provide automatic collision avoidance services as well as navigation services through our APIs.
So I have to pause and rewind myself there. So what you're basically saying is that if you are somebody who makes drones, you can use your secret sauce magic system to effectively mean that those drones will not crash into general aviation, airliners, other drones, that sort of thing?
So you're definitely on the right track. It's certainly our roadmap is to be, to increase our awareness of everything in the airspace. But I want to emphasize, it's important for Altitude Angel that it's not just about things, other things that fly. It's also about making sure that, as a drone pilot, we're aware of things on the ground that are, potentially hazards to us, or that potentially by flying we are a hazard too. So a good example there would be, flying over a school or flying near a train station, things that aren't typically covered by a no-fly zone, as people would, the headlines would certainly talk about, but things that is, hazardous to us. So you mentioned general aviation. That's something we're working on right now, and we'll have the ability to be able to see, quote unquote, most commercial air traffic. And by that then allows us to send in advance notifications to a drone operator to say, hey, you need to be aware that something's changed in the airspace. You need to be aware of, this helicopter approaching. We're not talking about, Virgin Atlantic flights, whatever it is at 30,000 feet. That's irrelevant to you as a drone pilot. But then what we can do, this is where the automatic part comes in. Once we sense that, once we've given you a warning about what's about to happen, you get the option to essentially say, yes, I want to take the suggested action from Altitude Angel to avoid that potential situation, or no, I don't. But actually, if you don't answer either way, we'll take the suggested action anyway, because we assume that perhaps the pilot is unable to do so. So this is quite useful in situations where, certainly in the consumer community, people don't necessarily have the best level of control over their aircraft. Even in commercial situations, sometimes it's easy to lose control as well. So it's kind of like a safety switch for a drone. For whatever reason, if you're unable to take that action yourself, we'll take it for you.
And that's pretty radical. That's a very radical concept when you think about it, because previously a lot of systems for drones have sort of gone down the route of sense and avoid. There'll be something on the drone that's looking out, and those have been demonstrated. We've seen them on YouTube. People kind of in a demonstration hall, somebody stands in front of the drone and it senses them and stops.
Yeah.
But of course, the thing that I've always thought about that is that's great, but what happens if your drone's going along at 30 miles an hour? There's just no time to react. So what your system doesn't use sensors on the drone. It's actually using its own knowledge of the world around the drone and then telling the drone to avoid things that it might have seen miles away or minutes away from being a problem rather than yards or seconds.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of distinctions in our sort of very brief history, and as we look forwards, there are a couple of phases where we're going to add additional functionality that kind of play directly to what you just described. So today, what we can do is we are very much focused on what we call macro scale navigation services, and that's to say essentially that it's great having Sense and Avoid, and Altitude Angel isn't a replacement for Sense and Avoid, it's a supplemental tool for drones that do have it. It's important to remember that the majority of drones sold today, and certainly that are coming up, don't have any Sense and Avoid either. But this is essentially to say, you know, as a drone pilot, when you're operating your drone, having in advance warning of situations that could pose a hazard to you, you know, it is actually much better than reacting at the last minute to something that has changed. So what Altitude Angel is doing today essentially is giving a pilot, it's almost like actually having a co-pilot sat next to you. It's giving you some airspace awareness that you wouldn't otherwise have. And it's also telling you about things on the ground that you also need to be aware of. And as we look forwards to the future, you know, one of the things I want specifically for Altitude Angel is to help anyone who is building a Sense and Avoid functionality from being less reactive. So a goal for me there is, for example, what we typically see with localized Sense and Avoid systems is they have a very short range radius, sometimes, you know, maybe only 10 meters or so. What happens is if you have two drones that are in a conflict equipped with a Sense and Avoid system, they execute their default action, which is usually, let's just say, for the sake of argument, fly left. So you have these two drones that try and avoid each other. The problem with that is if you introduce a third aircraft or a restriction like a wall, for example, you get very reactive, unpredictable, unplanned behavior. So the reason we call ourselves a macro scale navigation company is we look to try and deconflict that airspace from becoming too congested in the first place. So we're looking to try, and that's why we call it plan to avoid rather than sense and avoid. But flicking right forward, you know, right to the end of our development roadmap, which is currently about 6 months out, but anything could change in the next half hour, I think is the phrase. As we look out to that point, what we're looking to do is to start giving drones equipped with those sense and avoid systems an escape plan. So it's kind of a plan that we, you know, every few seconds we renew it and give it back to the drone and we say, look, if your proximity sensors are triggered, this is your safe coordinate to go to. And it'll be a set of coordinates that's registered with Altitude Angel, and we know that we won't send any other drones there temporarily for the lifetime of that warning. So again, we're very much focused on what's happening now in real time, in the air and on the ground, but equally a few seconds up to a minute ahead of time.
So pretty much how full-scale air traffic control computers work then, because they're always, you know, when you see those maps of all the airliners, their current sort of projected path is being shown to the controllers, and that's how they work out conflicts. So you're doing something very similar for drones, because you know where they are and what speed they're going in direction and what control inputs. You can always be working on your system anyway can be working on a solution to.
Yeah, the challenge for us as a drone company is, you know, when you're dealing with commercial aviation, you typically are dealing with something that's quite large and has its flight plan filed in advance. With pretty much all drone air traffic today, we are pretty much reactive. You know, no one is required to file a flight plan in advance, and there's certainly no authority checking that, you know, you're sticking to that flight plan. So that limits a little bit what, you know, can be done from a safety perspective, which is why, you know, for today, what we focus on is that reactive element. It's the ability for anyone to pick up a drone, connect it to Altitude Angel and go fly. And in real time, we provide those deconfliction services. What we're adding is the ability for, and it's probably going to be commercial operators of drones that are more interested in this, we're adding the ability for them to then start doing all of their due diligence ahead of time, file their flight plans ahead of time, and then we can register those commercial flight plans with Altitude Angel's reactive flight management system and make sure that even a drone that isn't there yet but might be a conflict to you in a few minutes' time, you know, we can keep you clear of that. So we're looking to, you know, essentially build this large platform that ingests data both in real time and ahead of time to deconflict the airspace and provide safety and enhanced navigational services to drones.
Brilliant. Which is, we're talking. This is quite when we look at people like Amazon and their proposed drone delivery service, for example, which everyone sits there and sort of says, well, of course it'll never happen. And the main reason why it can't happen isn't to do with the technology of the aircraft and the load capacity and everything. It's the fact that how will it avoid other things in the air? And what you're now saying is, well, hello, over here at Altitude Angel, we might have sorted that out for you. But it not only in a way that actually can be applied to any platform. So what was interesting, you said that you've got there's the two elements of it. There's the knowing where things are and what's coming up and giving you avoidance advice, but then also being able to, if required, actually take control and make the drone avoid if required. Yeah. How does Altitude Angel connect to the drones? What's the system whereby it's issuing those commands?
Sure. So I guess there's a couple of pieces to that. The first is that actually we aren't specifically aligned to any one drone vendor or any software vendor. In fact, we make a big thing, if you head over to our website, which I encourage you all to do, if you head over to our website, you will see that the API is open. And that means that anybody who is involved in making drones or making software for drones or even cloud services for drones can essentially connect to our system and have all of the benefits of that system delivered to their platform. And in fact, one of the things we're working on right now is a plugin for 3D robotics drones through the Linux Foundation and the Drone Code project. But in terms of sending commands back to a drone, Altitude Angel, we kind of, as a software company, we draw a line around our web services and say, right, that's our area of responsibility. And that last mile, we call it last mile communication from the drone to the cloud is essentially the responsibility of the integrator. Now, what we're seeing more and more, there are lots of companies out there that are starting to think about putting 3G or 4G cellular chips onto drones to give them a persistent connection to the internet. It's absolutely true that we need a persistent connection to be able to provide our automation services back to the drone. But a lot of folks are now fixing this problem for us, which is absolutely great. In fact, one of the things that Altitude Angel does track is the reliability of the connection between the drone back to our cloud service. And one of the things we recognize is, cellular coverage, certainly, if that's the answer, it isn't perfect, it's patchy. Certainly in rural locations, sometimes it can be non-existent, but it's typically, you will get some signal, then you'll lose it. You'll get some signal, then you'll lose it. So Altitude Angel factors that in when it's controlling your drone, and it increases these kind of virtual bubbles of risk around your aircraft and other areas to compensate for the reduced frequency of communication from you. So we do what we can to mitigate the risks that we see, but it's not designed, and this is I want to stress this, we're not here to replace a competent operator. We're here to supplement that pilot and essentially help that person make much better decisions.
Yeah, and that was the thing I think that I was getting at there, because one of the things you mentioned is you're working for a plugin which would work with 3DR's drones. And if you look at 3DR's Solo, for example, although I don't believe the drone itself has data connectivity to the internet, like a lot of manufacturers, the control is now being, or at least information is being handed over to apps, which if they're on a mobile phone or which has a Wi-Fi or data connection is doing that. So are you saying then that going forward, any of us with a consumer level drone at the moment that has some sort of app connection to talk to the drone in any way, perhaps it's just to adjust the camera or to load up some waypoints, then in theory, whoever's making that app could use your API and put it in. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, obviously DJI's Go app for its Phantom 3 series, but also there are several independent developers at the moment who are developing independent apps for the Phantom 3. So with the right, and again, I'm not a software engineer, but with the right tweaking in the background, they could quite relatively straightforwardly link into your system right now as it stands.
Yeah, in fact, it's probably worth pointing out, the most popular mechanism we've seen, and we're in closed beta, but throughout our testing community, the most popular mechanism we've seen for folks that want to integrate with Altitude Angel is via some kind of ground station. And that ground station is either typically, a laptop or a tablet that's then tethered via Bluetooth to a mobile phone to give it internet access, or even, in the case of 3DR drones, perhaps using the Tower app for an Android phone, straight away you've got a device which is receiving telemetry via a short-range radio link from the drone, and it's two-way communication to the phone. And the phone itself is a cellular phone, right? So it has a web connection. And it's that we're then able to take that telemetry from that phone or from that ground station app, relay that to Altitude Angel. And again, Altitude Angel's watching the latency between the telemetry that we see via the ground station link, and then compensating in any instructions that it sends back.
That's really interesting. So there, again, for those of us who are more on the consumer side, I can see two areas where we, there could be some interaction with Altitude Angel. One would be where a manufacturer decides to use your service, so it comes out of the box ready to go in an app. But the other could be that, providing that, if you've got some developer ability and the product that you're flying has an SDK, or you, then relatively straightforwardly people could start building in these kind of air traffic control systems effectively for their individual drone. Now, one of the things that you mentioned sort of earlier on was, as well as collision avoidance, one of the interesting things you said was also potentially avoiding airspace or objects or places. Mm-hmm. Well, how does that work? I mean, airspace, I would imagine that you can just get the information from the FAA, the CAA, whoever controls the airspace. But how would somebody decide that there's a concert going on or a big sports event, we want to make sure that people don't fly over with drones, it's too risky to our competitors? How does that work?
So, I mean, some of the stuff that you're talking about is getting a little close to our secret sauce, but we'll be releasing details of this soon. But essentially what we have is an enormous platform, a cloud-based platform that ingests data. Now, you'd certainly think that for things like airspace information, NOTAMs, flight restrictions, aviation hazards, that you would have good quality sources of data, and that's not always the case, and it's not always easy to get hold of as a software company. So certainly in the UK and in the US, we have really great coverage. And as you go and look across Europe, there are different systems, there are different entities that you work with. And again, if you look at Asia, there's a different kettle of fish there as well. So it's what we've built is the tools for people to either push that information to us, and then we assess essentially the authoritativeness of that data, the quality of it, and then make that available throughout the airspace system. And then there are other types of data where we essentially mine it or collect it from other providers that do have authority. And again, we then standardize all of this in our system so that it becomes available to anyone that's using our APIs, essentially, that wants to do that integration. I guess the key thing there is, there is quite a lot of data that we originate, that we are creating ourselves. So for example, we have a proprietary hazard database of things that are hazardous to drones that aren't no-fly zones. So a really great example there would be power pylons or high-frequency radio towers, power station infrastructure, that kind of stuff. So we're looking through various different sources of map data for different countries in which we operate to build up our own proprietary hazard database. And then there are things that actually, there aren't necessarily hazards, and it's not probably illegal to do, but are privacy concerns. So we have, we saw a spate of websites at the beginning of the year and into last year where folks were saying, come along, register a no-fly zone. There's no precedent for that in law, as far as I'm aware, that allows someone to create a civilian no-fly zone above their house. Certainly not in the UK anyway. But one of the things Altitude Angel can do is provide information about folks who have said, hey, I don't want you to fly here. And what we're looking at is kind of like a mode selector switch on our website, or on our services rather, that lets the pilot decide what level of compliance they want to fly with. So for example, the person that just gets the drone and flies out the box and just says, hey, I want you to keep me safe, we'll do our absolute best to monitor all of the changing airspace, all the areas in which you shouldn't be flying, and almost geofence them, stop you flying into them. But for the more conscientious pilot, the pilot who is perhaps a bit more competent, wants to take more of the control themselves, we operate in an advise first fashion and take action if you don't reply to say yes or no. So you can always override Altitude Angel. But the point is we will obviously log the fact that you ignored some advice we gave you, because you might want to see, for your own benefit later on after a flight, why did I crash into that tree? That's because I ignored the advice I was given. And all the way to the other end of the spectrum, where actually we don't advise you first, we'll just immediately take action if you breach a no-fly zone. But for example, we would just be able to show you that you were flying near privacy zones, folks, perhaps like a school, for example, that kind of thing. So the point is, the pilot is always the person who makes the determination about the level of compliance with which they want to fly. It's up to us to be able to provide as much information as we can about the physical environment, and as well as the airspace environment, which is a dynamic environment.
Sure. So I mean that's really I think the key, because I know a lot of people, even if they kind of can intrinsically see the benefits of keeping your drone away from certain areas and not flying over people who have concerns about that, the sort of good neighbor policy. There are people who understand that. People are generally reluctant to have something that clamps the functionality down. Well, what you're saying is that what they can do is they could receive an on-screen advisory to say you're getting close to somewhere. If you choose to ignore it, well then, that's down to you as an adult. Hopefully you can charge one of these, you could take the consequences of that or whatever. Yeah. Or you could even say, look, I'm brand new, I don't want to get into any trouble at all, flick the switch, and it will not allow you to go into these kind of areas, whether they're legally restricted or just for whatever, you can select, I guess you say you can select a suite of things. I want to, no privacy issues, I don't want to go anywhere near power lines, I don't want to go anywhere, and so on. And that gives you back an element of control. Perhaps as you're doing a commercial job that requires you to go through there, then you can override it, but in your general kind of operation, you may want to just stay clear usually.
Yeah, essentially, certainly in the default mode that we're envisaging today, Altitude Angel will always present to you some information that you need to be aware of as the pilot. And that could be, you are about to encroach on an area of no-fly zone or in a hazard area. What do you want to do? And essentially we'll be giving you an instruction that we're about to execute for you if you don't either say, no, I don't want that, or you ignore us. So the idea, by you ignoring us, we're just assuming that you may be incapacitated somehow, or you may have lost control of your aircraft, you may be otherwise engaged, you may have completely forgotten what's going on and dealing with your son, who is trying to play with something else, and forgetting that you're flying this machine. So in those scenarios, Altitude Angel will try and take default action to help keep you safer. In other scenarios, actually it's not just about no-fly zones, privacy zones, it's also about compliance and law. And for example, most drone operators today still aren't aware, certainly on the consumer side, that there are maximum altitudes, maximum distance that you can fly. So Altitude Angel enforces those local territorial laws wherever you happen to take off. So even if you have, only one drone and you're in the UK and you start flying, we'll apply UK law automatically for you. If you go to the US with that drone, same drone, turn it on, it knows it's in the US and it applies different rules. And that's one of the benefits from a vendor's perspective, is to say, well, these laws are going to change, and they're going to change frequently. And in Europe, there's a big consultation about that. In the US, there's lots of talk about it, and it's probably going to change in some states on a state-by-state basis. The point is, if you integrate with Altitude Angel, we'll do our absolute best to make sure that compliance is dealt with for you, and that you as a drone operator aren't falling foul of the law. And it's important to remember, we've seen already our first prosecutions here in the UK, for example. The chap that flew his, I think it was a DJI Phantom or something like that, flew it over a BAE Systems submarine base. Not a great thing to do, but the point is, probably didn't know that there were restrictions about that, and equally probably didn't have access to high quality airspace information. So one of the things Altitude Angel wants to do is commoditize making that information available to everybody. We think that, actually, drones are here to stay. They're a very, very good thing. There are so many ways in which they can benefit businesses, humanitarian causes, but not if we don't show as an industry that we can collectively take responsibility for flying more safely. So Altitude Angel at its core is a solution for helping to integrate drones into a national airspace system.
Yeah. No, I think going forward, it's probably the only way we're going to avoid as an industry, as a hobby, as people who enjoy aerial photography, flying, whatever it is the only way we're going to avoid some pretty draconian restrictions or registration or outright bans is if the industry can quickly put together something that says, actually, there's no need for that because you've set the law. We can now have something that will automatically govern. Now, there's going to be some issues because some people, a bit like with their cars, some people think that they are able to they want to, they can break the speed limit or whatever. There's always going to be that sort of people. I do believe that the vast majority of people involved in the industry want it to continue in a way that is safe and responsible and still allows people the flexibility to kind of, enjoy the freedom that it can give. So that's really important. So right now, from my understanding then, if anybody's watching this and thinks that's fantastic, I'd like that on my drone now, it sounds to me like as it stands at the moment, you need to be someone who is kind of involved in the software side of them, who can integrate so how can we as mere mortals, do you think, either now or in the future, what's the route to us as out of the box drone flyers having access to this?
So that's a great question. And essentially when we go live, kind of lifting the lid off of our services for the first time, first week in November, the manifestation of that service is essentially going to be anyone in the world will be able to go to our website and essentially look at a very high quality airspace map that shows them everything that's around, all the restrictions they need to be aware of, all of the hazards, all of the no-fly zones, all of the points of interest. And they'll be able to go on there just to check that they're flying compliantly. Following that very shortly, we're going to be looking at having and releasing our plugin for the 3DR drones, which will probably work initially with Mission Planner. There's GCS as well and a couple of other ground station tools that we're looking at. But we're also going to be simultaneously contributing back to the drone code project. So we're going to be code that we're writing for our own purposes, we're going to be pushing back into the drone code community. And we're also working with a number of software vendors at the moment who are building third-party control apps for various different drones. We're also in talks with a number of hardware manufacturers who are making modules rather that plug into existing drones. So today, we're absolutely happy to have any of your viewers that are perhaps more on the software side of things, if they want to integrate their homegrown drone, that kind of thing, something that you've built with Altitude Angel, that's great. We don't have a restriction on the type of flight controllers that are in those drones. All you have to be able to do is send and receive telemetry from Altitude Angel, and it's actually something we've obsessed about, is making that as simple as possible to do. So if you have some basic programming skills, probably if you are in that drone community anyway and you're building your own hardware, you have got some, because let's face it, it's not always plug and play. That's the kind of community that we would welcome certainly in the next few months. And over time, we'll be releasing more and more of our own tools to help seed that community of folks that want to integrate it into their own ecosystem, whether that's a cloud control system, or that's a local control system, or even the hardware vendors themselves.
Well, that's good news. I'm really pleased, because for people like me who are not very techy, but who really like the tech, the idea that at some point in the not too distant future we might be able to buy a module that we can just add to our existing out-of-the-box hardware, plug it in, and be able to access all of this is really exciting.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And obviously, so if people want to know more, they can go and visit the website, which is
altitudeangel.com.
Marvelous.
Nice and simple.
I like a nice simple website. Richard, thank you very much indeed for your time. That's really appreciated, and best of luck with this. And I think this is a really potentially has some massive benefits to the community. And it's nice to see a British company leading the way. It's
fun, and thank you for having me. I think in closing, one thing I'd really love to just get out there and say to folks is, look, we don't charge for any of our airspace services at all. And in fact, when you download those plugins, if you're a hardware vendor, if you are a software vendor, there's no charge to use those APIs and get access to those collision avoidance services or get access to that airspace information. The only requirement is that you participate in Altitude Angel's air traffic network. And doing so is easy, and it makes you much safer, and it gives you a lot of information that you wouldn't otherwise have. So we really see no reason why folks can't integrate with us, and we would love to have folks come along to our website, altitudeangel.com. There is a link on the site as well. If you sign up for something called the Insiders Club, that essentially is a mailing list, but it's only for a more technical community that are interested in knowing what our roadmap is and how to get involved in helping us to prioritize essentially our development backlog. We're not a huge multinational organization. We're a well-funded startup, and we're growing, but we would love input and feedback from the community, from your community. So thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Richard, from Altitude Angel.
we're about to essentially lift the lid off of our services for the first time, and that's happening probably first week of November. And the way that's going to manifest itself, shall I start that bit again? Do you want to ask me that question? Sorry. Don't publish that.